87 years ago, on September 30th, 1938, Europe crossed a line it could never step back from. In Munich, inside a room filled with forced smiles and quiet betrayals, the leaders of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, the United Kingdom, and France gathered to make a decision that would change the continent forever. A decision made without the country whose fate was being discussed. That night, the Munich Agreement was signed, and Czechoslovakia, an independent European nation, was treated not as a partner, not as an ally, but as a bargaining chip. The Western powers, desperate to satisfy Adolf Hitler, agreed to hand over the Sudetenland, 1/5 of Czechoslovakia's territory, home to a quarter of its population, and packed with military industry and fortifications essential to the nation's defense. Czechoslovakia was excluded from the negotiations entirely. Its future was handed to it as a fait accompli. Within days, the German army moved in. By October 10, 1938, the Sudetenland was occupied. Nazi banners went up. Border posts came down. The defenses Czechoslovakia had spent years building were now in Hitler's hands. This moment would be remembered not as a peace agreement, but as the Munich Conspiracy, the definitive failure of the West's policy of appeasement. In the weeks leading up to Munich, the pressure on Czechoslovakia was immense. Britain and France, terrified of another war and convinced they could manage Hitler, presented Prague with an ultimatum: surrender the Sudetenland to Germany or face the consequences alone. For Czechoslovakia, this was more than political betrayal. France was not just a friendly nation, it was an ally with signed security guarantees. Yet Paris broke its commitment. London encouraged surrender. Both powers believed that sacrificing part of Czechoslovakia would satisfy Hitler's ambition and preserve peace. But appeasement never stops an aggressor, it only fuels him. In this crisis, one major power publicly stated it was willing to support Czechoslovakia: the Soviet Union. President Edvard Beneš reached out for help, and Moscow responded that it would honor its treaty. By late September 1938, the Red Army had deployed 40 divisions and 20 brigades along its western frontier, placed them on alert, and mobilized roughly 330,000 reservists. But there was a problem. A geopolitical obstacle that made Soviet intervention nearly impossible: Poland. The Soviet Union needed permission to move its forces through Polish territory to reach Czechoslovakia. Warsaw refused. Not only did it block troop transit, it even denied passage to Soviet aircraft. Poland's leadership feared Soviet presence on its soil more than it feared Hitler's ambitions. And behind the scenes, Polish officials saw an opportunity. If Germany was taking a piece of Czechoslovakia, perhaps Poland could take one too. And that's exactly what happened. Immediately after the Munich Agreement, Polish troops crossed into the Cieszyn district, a disputed area they had long coveted. Instead of defending a neighbor facing destruction, Poland seized land while Germany dismantled the rest of the country. In doing so, Poland became an accomplice, willingly or not, in Hitler's plans. The consequences of the Munich Conspiracy were catastrophic. For Europe, it was a turning point, a moment when the existing security system proved hollow, and the Western powers revealed that they were unable or unwilling to stand up to aggression. Hitler saw the weakness, and he exploited it fully. In March 1939, not even 6 months after Munich, Germany invaded the remainder of Czechoslovakia. No negotiations, no excuses, no pretext. The country was broken apart and occupied. The collapse didn't stop there. In the same spring, Hitler seized the Klaipėda region of Lithuania, including the vital port of Memel. Italy, following the path of conquest, invaded Albania. The map of Europe was being torn apart piece by piece. With each victory, Hitler's confidence grew, and so did his ambitions. By mid-1939, the German High Command finalized Plan Weiss, the invasion of Poland. The same Poland that had taken Teschen from Czechoslovakia just months earlier. The same Poland that believed appeasement would protect it. But appeasement protects no one. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. And just 2 days later, the world plunged into the war that Munich was meant to prevent. Looking back, the crisis of 1938 is more than a prelude to the Second World War. It's a lesson, a warning about the dangers of backroom deals, political illusions, and the belief that peace can be bought by sacrificing the rights of smaller nations. The Munich Conspiracy destroyed the final chance to create a united front against Nazi Germany. Had Europe's powers acted together, had Czechoslovakia, France, Britain, Poland, and the Soviet Union coordinated, Hitler's early aggression might have been stopped before it grew unstoppable. Instead, alliances fractured, mistrust deepened, and the dictator who was handed the Sudetenland soon consumed the entire continent. The Munich Conspiracy exposed the fatal flaw in appeasement, that accommodating an aggressor only makes him stronger. It revealed the moral crisis of Europe's leadership, a willingness to trade principle for temporary calm, to negotiate away another nation's sovereignty, and to hope that a storm could be avoided by closing one's eyes. It also showed how geopolitical calculations, rivalries, and mistrust, especially between Poland, the USSR, and the Western democracies, prevented any possibility of collective security. Europe was fragmented at precisely the moment it needed unity the most. The catastrophe that followed was not inevitable, but Munich made it much closer. In 1938, the leaders of Europe believed they were avoiding war. What they actually did was guarantee it. By allowing Hitler to seize Czechoslovakia's fortified border regions, industrial centers, and strategic high ground, they handed him the tools he needed for further conquest. Within a year, the continent was in flames. The Munich Conspiracy remains one of the clearest examples in modern history of what happens when powerful nations choose compromise over courage, and when the rights of smaller states become bargaining chips in a cynical geopolitical game. It stands as a reminder that peace built on fear is fragile, peace built on betrayal is temporary, and peace built on the sacrifice of others is no peace at all.
But the story of the Munich Agreement doesn't end with the signatures on a document, or with the German army marching into the Sudetenland. What followed in the months after 1938 is just as important, because it reveals how one act of political surrender reshaped alliances, exposed hidden motives, and accelerated the collapse of Europe's security system. In Prague, the aftermath of Munich felt like standing in the ruins after an earthquake. Czechoslovakia had lost its fortified border, its industries, and a quarter of its population. But it had lost something deeper as well: trust in the nations that once claimed to be its protectors. The army was demoralized, the government was cornered, and the country's strategic depth had evaporated. Inside what remained of Czechoslovakia, people held on to a fragile hope that perhaps Germany would be satisfied. Maybe the Sudetenland was enough. Maybe the great powers would finally step in if Hitler pushed further. But Hitler had already made his intentions clear. Munich was never about protecting ethnic Germans. It was about momentum. It was about demonstrating that the Western powers lacked the will to resist him. Across Europe, leaders watched this transformation with rising fear. In London, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich claiming he had achieved peace for our time. Crowds cheered him, newspapers praised him. The public, scarred by memories of World War I, desperately wanted to believe him. But inside Britain's own government, doubts grew. Some officials understood that Hitler had not been stopped, he had been emboldened. Military intelligence warned that Germany's ambitions stretched far beyond the Sudetenland. But these warnings were overshadowed by the desire for stability at any cost. In Prague, the sense of shame after abandoning an ally was real. French officers knew that by surrendering Czechoslovakia's border defenses to Germany, they had weakened their own position. The French army relied on the Maginot Line, but without Czechoslovakia to anchor the eastern flank, the strategic map of Europe tilted sharply in Germany's favor. And in Moscow, the Soviet leadership studied every development with cold calculation. To them, Munich was not just a betrayal, it was a signal. It suggested that the Western democracies were willing to negotiate with Hitler behind closed doors, even if it meant sacrificing smaller nations. Stalin wondered, if they could abandon Czechoslovakia, what would stop them from abandoning the Soviet Union next? These fears would soon drive Moscow to a decision that shocked the world, a decision that would reshape the early years of the coming war. But at this moment, late 1938, Europe was still pretending that peace had been preserved. Inside Germany, however, there was no illusion. Hitler celebrated Munich as a strategic triumph. He viewed the Western powers as weak, divided, and easy to manipulate. In his private conversations, he mocked their willingness to surrender territory without a fight. He said, "Our enemies are worms. I saw them at Munich." The acquisition of the Sudetenland gave Germany a treasure trove of weapons factories, steelworks, and fortifications. These industrial gains dramatically accelerated German rearmament. The border defenses built by the Czechoslovakians, some of the most advanced in Europe, would now be turned outward, strengthening Germany itself. The Nazis had gained confidence, resources, and prestige. But more importantly, they had gained momentum. Once the Sudetenland fell, the rest of Czechoslovakia was exposed, and by March 1939, Hitler made his next move. German troops marched into Prague. No negotiations, no excuses, just occupation. The state of Czechoslovakia was dissolved. The regions were carved up, puppet governments installed, and resistance crushed. Europe now saw the full consequences of Munich. Appeasement had not preserved peace, it had dismantled a nation. The collapse of Czechoslovakia triggered political shockwaves. Britain and France finally realized that negotiations with Hitler were meaningless. The guarantees they issued after Munich had been torn apart in 6 months. Their strategy of appeasement lay in ruins. With Czechoslovakia gone, both countries began military preparations that should have started years earlier. Britain expanded its air force, France increased mobilization, but the lost time could not be regained. Germany had already secured critical resources and strategic positions that gave it overwhelming advantages. Poland watched this happening with growing dread. Only months earlier, it had joined in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia by seizing the Teschin district. But now that same opportunism came back to haunt it. Germany no longer needed Polish cooperation. He needed Polish territory, and he began demanding it, specifically the Polish corridor and the city of Danzig. Poland refused, but it was isolated. The West could offer guarantees, but could they be trusted after Munich? And the Soviet Union, still angry at Poland's refusal to allow troop transit in 1938, had little inclination to assist. Munich had fractured European diplomacy so completely that by 1939, no nation fully trusted another. The next move came from Moscow. After watching the Western powers negotiate away Czechoslovakia, Stalin believed that relying on them was dangerous. He feared they might try a similar arrangement with Hitler to redirect German aggression toward the east. So, in August 1939, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression treaty with a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. To the world, this was shocking, but to Stalin, Munich had made it predictable.
If the West could make deals with Hitler at the expense of smaller nations, why couldn't he? The last chance for a united front against Nazi Germany died in Munich. Everything afterward, the Soviet-German Pact, the invasion of Poland, the fall of France, the Blitz, unfolded in the shadow of that failure. And so, on September 1st, 1939, the inevitable happened. German forces stormed into Poland, initiating the most destructive war in human history. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. Europe, which had hoped to avoid conflict through compromise, now found itself engulfed in total war. Munich had shown that yielding to aggression does not satisfy an aggressor. It accelerates his timetable. It increases his appetite. It validates his belief that force prevails over diplomacy. The Munich Agreement did not prevent World War II. It prepared the battlefield for it. It demonstrated how quickly alliances can collapse when trust is broken, how dangerous it is when powerful nations negotiate over the fate of weaker ones, and how a single diplomatic failure can trigger a chain reaction that spirals beyond anyone's control. The legacy of Munich continues to echo today, shaping how nations respond to threats, how alliances are formed, and how the world remembers the cost of appeasement. Because the truth remains, when aggression goes unanswered, it grows stronger. When justice is delayed, danger advances. And when the fate of nations is decided behind closed doors, history is often written in the ruins left behind.